Hey guys, I'm back with another video on my motorcycle, obviously. But you'll probably notice that there's another camera in shot pointed back at me. And that's because I've changed my setup a little bit and I've got myself a second camera. So this second camera is exactly the same as my first camera, which is an Insta360 ONE RS, but the difference being that it has a 360 lens. Which means not only can you see from my perspective now, but you can look back at me and I can address the camera as well. And the great thing about this being a 360 camera is not only can I address you directly, but I can whip the camera around and you can see out the front of the bike. Now you may be thinking, what is the point of seeing out the front of the bike if you've already got a camera strapped to your chin? Well, it's not just about being able to see out the front of the bike, but things that I may go past, points of interest, you could lock onto them and track them as I go past, all kinds of stuff. Or, you know, other bits and bobs in the scene. You could even do cool things like make the field of view so wide on the 360 camera that you get different kinds of effects. I think you can do like a little planet effect with a 360 camera. All of this I will have to find out when I get the footage back, actually, because I've never actually edited 360 footage before. I'm hoping well, look, you can see where I've got this thing mounted. I wanted to have it mounted on the handlebars, but the brake fluid box on the right hand side here is too close to the bars for me to be able to get this camera bracket around it. And on the other side there's no room because that's where my phone mount is. So I've had to actually attach this camera to the arm of my mirror. And as you can imagine, the arm that goes to my mirror is quite a lot thinner than my handlebars. So I'm just hoping that it holds there okay. So I'll give that little bit of a check in a minute when I get to a decent speed. It'll be interesting to see what this 360 footage is like, because obviously you've got two lenses filming, front and back, and they get stitched together. But my sort of, you know, the things that I think about is like, well, what if one lens is exposed differently to the other end? Aren't you going to get a huge stitch line or something like that? Or, you know, all kinds of other shit. So, like I said, this is the first time I've used a 360 camera, and I'm sure I'll find out the answer to these questions once I get the footage back. What I'm really worried about is if this thing moving, but I've got to say, even on my mirror arm, it actually seems quite solid. I mean, I'm actually grabbing it and seeing if I can move it, and it's yeah, it's pretty good. So we'll have to just see what it's like when we get back. Something else that I'm interested to see as well, and I don't know how the camera handles this, but the stabilization. Because on my chin mounted camera, you've actually got an option. It says, hey, do you want your stabilization on or off? If it is on, you get the option of low, medium and high. But on this camera, when you've got the 360 lens attached, you don't get any options for stabilization. And I had a quick look on the internet, and apparently it's just on. You don't get the option. So I'm actually interested to know if stabilization is just built into the footage, you know, anyway, and you don't have the choice to turn it off or not. What level is it at? Is it just on full tilt the whole time?
Okay, so we took the 360 lens and wanted to test it at night, and this is what you're looking at now. This is test 1, and at the bottom there you can see our settings listed. Now there are settings that won't change between tests, and we don't care about those, and that is resolution, FPS, the EV and the white balance. What we're interested in is the shutter speed and the ISO setting. So let's start with shutter speed. In this clip it's set to auto, and what that means is the camera will determine what the shutter speed is. Now I should imagine in an environment like this where it's very, very dark, it's going to use the slowest shutter speed possible. The problem with that is shutter speed is also directly related to how much motion blur you're getting. So if this is using the slowest speed, you're going to get a very smeary look. And if we look at this footage, you can see that it is quite sort of smeary and blended. Ideally, what you want is your shutter speed to be the double of FPS. So in this case, it'll be 1/60. Moving on to ISO, we can see that it's set at 1600 max. Now I should explain that if the ISO level has got max written after it, what that means is that's the ceiling, that's the highest it can go. So what the camera will do is be able to bounce between 0 and the ceiling of 1600 when it sees fit. But again, in this very, very dark scenario, I should imagine it's not going to be anywhere close to ISO 100 or 200 at any point. I should imagine it will be floating around, if not fixed, at the max of 1600. The problem with ISO is because it's basically visual gain, if you like, is that it can introduce a lot of grain into your footage, a lot of noise. So if we look at this footage overall, it seems like we're getting a good amount of light, but we're getting that smearing because of the shutter speed, and we're getting a lot of grain because of the ISO. Okay, this is test 2. It was recorded on exactly the same stretch of road as test 1, and we've tweaked some of the settings. So let's start with shutter speed. To compensate for some of that extreme motion blur we were getting in test 1, I've actually set the shutter speed to 1/100, and the ISO, in an attempt to get rid of some of that grain that we were getting in test 1, instead of it being ISO 1600 as it was before, I've reduced that to 800 max. Now the result of this is actually a cleaner image. Unfortunately, we're not getting enough light into the camera sensor, so it is very, very dark. The highlights are being picked out great, but there's just not enough overall illumination. Okay, this is test 3, filmed on exactly the same stretch of road. The shutter speed is actually the same as it was in test 2, 1/100, but I've increased the ISO back to 1600 max in an attempt to boost some of that brightness. Now, although the brightness has gone up slightly, not as much as I would have liked, it has reintroduced that grain and that noise. Okay, on to test number 4. This is basically an attempt to find a happy medium between everything we've done so far. So, as you can see, the shutter speed is set to 1/60, which is double the FPS, so should give us the sort of correct motion blur while being slow enough to let enough light in. If we have a look at the ISO, you can see that it's set to 1250. Now you'll notice this hasn't got the word max after it, and that's because the camera will only do 800 max or 1600 max. There's nothing in between those two that has a max setting. So in this case, I had to actually lock it off at 1250. The reason I did this is because I'm trying to introduce some more of that brightness back in without introducing that gain. But if we look at the footage, it's still not bright enough. Yeah, it's just not getting enough light to that sensor, and the ISO at that level just isn't bringing it up enough. There's also another problem associated with test 4 in this footage, and I'll get onto that in a minute, but I think we should have a look at all of these side by side. I think it's pretty clear that by looking at all this footage together, that test 1 is really the only usable footage here. The others have varying degrees of quality, but there just isn't enough light there. Whereas test 1 does have plenty of light, but we've got that increased grain and that smearing quality. But there is something going on in test 4 that we need to fix. And ironically, the fix for this might actually allow us to get more light onto the sensor. Okay, so we're back here in test 4, and it's obviously not lit well, it's too dark. But let's have a look at the light being cast from the street lamps onto the surfaces of these houses and walls. You'll notice that there's a flicker there, kind of shimmering, a strobing effect. And this is caused by a mismatch between the power frequency of where I live, which is 50 Hertz, and the frames per second, or the shutter speed. In this case, there's a mismatch there. So what's happening is each frame is getting exposed to a different amount of light, and that is what's causing the flickering. It's even more pronounced before I left for my journey at the beginning of the test 4 footage. This is inside my indoor parking, and you can see the artificial lights strobing in the background there. It's even present in the daytime footage I took earlier. If you look on the right hand side there in the shop, you can see the artificial lights flickering. This is test 1, and it doesn't seem to be suffering from the same strobing. This is probably because the shutter speed is set to auto, so the camera is automatically setting the shutter speed to some multiple of 25. Test 2 has no issue either, and that's because the shutter speed is set to 1/100, so double the power frequency of 50 Hertz. Each frame will be receiving the same amount of light. And the same story is true for test 3 as well, because of the shutter speed of 1/100. So knowing this will help me calculate how to get flicker-free video. But let's take a look at how this might possibly help me force more light onto the sensor. Okay, so here we are at red.com, and on their website they've got this flicker-free video calculator. So let's just start at the top and go through this. So here we've got power frequency, and it's currently set to 60 Hertz, which is North America. So we don't want that because I'm in the UK, and here we've got 50 Hertz, which is Europe and most of Asia. And then you've got a slider to set your frames per second. So all of my footage so far I've recorded at 30 frames a second. So let's put this to 30. And over here it gives us the results. At the top we've got safe shutter angles. We don't need to worry about this because my cameras, you can't actually affect the shutter angles. You can, however, affect shutter speeds, which we've got here at the bottom. So this is basically telling us for a 50 Hertz power frequency at 30 frames a second, these are the safe shutter speeds to use so you do not get flickering artificial lights. This first one is going to do us no good. If we set our shutter speed to 1/33, or 1/30 being the closest, at 30 frames a second, you're just going to get like a lot of motion blur. So really, to get the correct amount of motion blur, you want to double the frame rate. So in this case, it would be 1/60. Now the closest to that is 1/50 here, because if you did do 1/60, you would get flickering. And this is what this is telling us. There is another solution to this. So if we actually drop the frame rate down to 25 frames a second, it's telling us we can use any shutter angles and any shutter speeds. It just doesn't matter. And that's because the frame rate is half of the power frequency. So it doesn't matter what the shutter speed is because the frames per second kind of sort that out. And the same if we double this as well. So if you go up to 50 frames a second, you can use any. It starts to break down, I think, once you get up to 100. Let's test this. So you can use any at 100, and you'd think at 150 it'd be safe, but then it's saying that there's no shutter angles or shutter speeds that will be safe. So I could film at 30 frames a second and use one of these shutter speeds, or I could use 25 frames a second and use any shutter speed I like. You're probably thinking, well, if the shutter speed's 1/50 of a second, whether you're, on 30 frames a second or 25 frames a second, what's the difference? Well, the difference is at 25 frames a second, because there's less frames every second, that means the shutter is open for longer on each of these frames. That is my thinking anyway. Okay, so we're back with another test. This is test 5, and this time we're recording a frame rate of 25 frames per second, and the shutter speed is 1/50. The ISO is at 1600 max. Now, just to look at this footage, it doesn't appear to be any better quality. It doesn't appear to be any brighter, at least compared to our best footage so far, which is test 1. It seems pretty much the same. So those changes really didn't do much. And in fact, just by my eye, it looks like it's less stable at this lower frame rate too. The only advantage here is that we can avoid that flickering at any shutter speed because the FPS is set to 25 frames a second. Let's have a look at them side by side. Well, in terms of quality, these two tests look very, very similar. They've got about the same amount of noise and the same amount of grain. And in fact, I'd say that test 1 seems slightly more stable, and this may be due to the higher frames per second. You may also notice that test 1 seems brighter, and this is probably because the shutter speed is set to auto, so it could be going as low as 1/30, and we'll address that in a minute. But let's have a look at how these two perform in settings with more ambient light. Again, in terms of quality, these tests are very, very similar. Same amount of noise, same amount of grain, but test 1 does look smoother and more stable, and again, that's probably due to the slightly higher FPS. Now, this test comparison isn't particularly fair because the shutter speed for test 1 is set to auto, so we have no idea what the camera is doing. So I'd like to record another test that is set to 30 FPS, but everything else is the same settings as test 5, and then we'll compare those two. Okay, so I went away and made this test 6, and it is exactly the same settings as test 5, apart from we are recording at 30 frames a second instead of 25. When compared to test 1, which so far has been the brightest, the shutter speed is now 1/50 instead of being set to auto. Just looking at this footage out the gate, it doesn't seem to be any better quality or any brighter, but we are viewing it in isolation, so let's get these side by side. So here's test 6 alongside test 1, and in terms of noise and grain, there's not much between them. Test 1 is slightly brighter, and I should imagine that is due to the shutter speed being set to auto, but all in all, not that much difference. And here we have test 6 alongside test 5, and again, very much the same kind of grain and noise, same kind of quality, same lighting. I think I'd probably go for test 6 over test 5 purely because of that extra 5 frames per second we're getting. So, what is the takeaway from all of this? Well, the 360 lens for the Insta360 ONE RS is a capable lens if you're shooting in the day and you have plenty of light coming into the sensor. At night, it's a different story. You're going to get a huge drop in quality, and it seems no matter what you do, it's going to be sitting in this quality area that is a big drop from shooting in daytime. So that's pretty much it, guys. If you want to leave a comment, or if you want to add to this in some way or make a suggestion, the more the merrier. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.